For 30 years, I let the whole world believe that the long steel building at the end of my property was nothing but a graveyard for dead cars. My own daughter thought the same. She had no idea that behind those rusted doors, under canvas covers and a careful coat of dust, sat a collection worth more than every house in our county combined. I kept that secret for one reason and one reason only: to protect her. And the day she married a smiling, silver-tongued man who smelled money the way a shark smells blood, I was glad I had. Because a few months later, while I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold, my caretaker called me with his voice shaking. He said my son-in-law had just cut the lock off Bay 9, and that the two men he had brought with him were carrying guns. I did not shout. I did not even stand up. I had seen this coming for a long time, and everything the man was about to do had already been arranged, by me, to end his entire fraudulent life. Before I tell you how it all came apart, do an old man a kindness. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me what town you are watching from tonight. It means more than you know to know how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning. One honest note before we begin. This story is a work of fiction. The voice you are hearing and the images you are seeing are AI-assisted. Names, places, and events are invented for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. But the lessons about family, greed, and quiet strength are very real. Now, let us begin. My name is Emmett Cade. I am 71 years old, and I live on a few dry acres outside Modesto in the flat, golden heart of California's Central Valley, where the heat comes up off the asphalt in the summer like breath off a sleeping animal. For 50 years, I made my living with cars, though not the way most people mean it. I did not sell new sedans off a bright lot with balloons on the sign. I found the forgotten ones. The rare, ruined, one-of-a-kind machines that had been left to rot in barns and backlots and the estates of men who died without telling anyone what they had. I bought them for scrap prices because that is what they looked like, piles of rust and cracked leather. And then, slowly, over months and sometimes years, in the quiet of my own shop, I brought them back to life. It was not a business to me. It was something closer to a calling, the raising of beautiful dead things. I found my first real one when I was 26, a racing car half buried under hay in a collapsing barn in Nevada, and the farmer sold it to me for $800, because to him it was a rusted headache taking up space. I spent 4 years and most of what I had bringing it back, and when it was done, it was worth more than the farm it came out of. That was the day I understood what I was for. The world is full of people who see only what a thing is right now. The rust, the ruin, the dust. I was born with the stubborn ability to see what it used to be and what it could be again, and to have the patience to close the distance between the two. Most men chase money. I chased forgotten beauty. And the money, when it came as a side effect of loving the right things when nobody else could see them. Most people who drove past my place saw a run-down old property with a big, ugly metal building on it. And they were not wrong about the building. From the outside, Bay 9 is about as charming as a shipping container the size of a church. The paint has gone to chalk. The doors are streaked with rust. Weeds grow up through the gravel around it. I planned it that way, because the single most valuable security system in the world is convincing people there is nothing worth stealing. Inside those unglamorous walls, though, under soft covers and climate control I paid dearly to install, sat the work of my whole life. A pre-war roadster that only 9 of were ever built. A racing coupe that had crossed a finish line in Europe before I was born. A muscle car so rare that collectors argued in magazines about whether it still existed. and more. Many more. Together, on a conservative day, worth somewhere north of $50 million. I built it with my late wife, Nadine, and I have to tell you about her because she is the reason for everything, the good and the hard alike. Nadine had the eye. I had the hands, but she had the eye. The uncanny ability to look at a wreck under a tarp and see not what it was, but what it could become. And to know, somehow, which forgotten machine would one day be worth a fortune, and which was just junk. We spent 40 years chasing those cars together, sleeping in the truck at auctions, eating cold sandwiches in salvage yards, laughing over engines at 2 in the morning. We never bought a big house. We never took the cruises other couples took. Every spare dollar went into the next car, into the collection, into a future we were building for the one person who mattered more than any of it. Our daughter, June. People sometimes ask, when they learn a little of the story, why we lived so plainly on top of a growing fortune, why we drove an old pickup and clipped grocery coupons while a museum's worth of value sat under covers in a metal building. The answer is Nadine. And the answer is a certain good kind of fear. She used to say that money is like a loud dog, that the moment you let it bark, everyone in the county knows you have something worth stealing. So we kept the dog quiet. We let people believe we scraped by, because a man who scrapes by is left alone. And being left alone was worth more to us than any comfort money could buy. We were not hiding the wealth out of shame or greed. We were hiding it the way you hide anything precious and fragile, out of the simple wisdom that the safest treasure is the one nobody knows to look for. June is 35 now, and she is the best thing Nadine and I ever made, better than any car we ever saved. She did not follow me into the trade. She has a heart too soft for the deal-making, and a mind set on healing things that breathe. And so she became a veterinarian, and she runs a small clinic on the edge of town where she treats farm dogs and old cats and the occasional injured hawk that somebody brings in a cardboard box. She never made much money at it, and she never cared. She would treat an animal for free and lose sleep over a stranger's sick horse. And I have never in my life been prouder of anyone. Nadine made me promise, at the end, that I would keep June safe. Not rich, safe. There is a difference, and it turned out to matter more than I ever imagined. Nadine was sick for a long time before she went, long enough for us to have the plain-spoken conversations most couples never get to have, the ones about after. She was not afraid for herself. She was afraid of exactly the kind of thing that eventually happened. She had seen it in other families. The vultures that circle a widow or an orphan the instant there is money in the air. And she made me swear that I would not let our life's work become the bait that drew a predator to our daughter. Keep the cars hidden, she told me, until you are certain of the hands they will fall into. And keep June's heart free, so that when a man loves her, she will know it is her he loves. I held her hand, and I promised. And for 3 years, I kept that promise perfectly. Then June came to Sunday dinner with a man wearing a watch too big for his wrist, and the test I had been dreading walked right through my front door. I kept the collection a secret, even from June, and I know some people will not understand that, so let me explain it plainly. I had spent 50 years around money and the people who chase it, and I had learned a hard truth. The moment people know you have a fortune, they change, and worse, the people around you change. I did not want my daughter's life turned into a target. I did not want her wondering every time a man smiled at her whether he saw her or saw the cars. So I let her believe, like everyone else, that her old man was comfortable but ordinary, that the big metal building was full of half-finished projects and rust, and that when I was gone, she would inherit a modest house and a lot of headaches. I thought I was protecting her. I was. I just did not yet know from whom. His name was Trent Voss, and June brought him to Sunday dinner about 2 years ago with the bright, nervous hope of a woman who has finally let herself believe she found the one. He was handsome in an expensive, over-groomed way, with a watch too big for his wrist and a handshake he had clearly practiced. He called himself an entrepreneur. He talked about deals and networks and opportunities in a smooth, fast river of words that never quite slowed down long enough for you to catch hold of anything solid. June looked at him like he had hung the moon, and I sat across my own table and felt something cold settle into my stomach. Because I have spent my whole life learning to tell the real thing from a fake, and everything about Trent Voss was a very good fake. You develop an instinct in my trade that never really switches off. A man brings you a car and swears it is all original, numbers matching, one owner, and you run your hand along the seam of the hood and you feel the half-millimeter of filler where the story stops being true. Trent was that car. The watch was real, I will give him that, but everything under the hood was Bondo and fresh paint. His stories did not quite line up. The companies he mentioned did not quite exist when you looked. His confidence was a beautiful paint job over something rusted and hollow. I said nothing to June, because a father who attacks the man his daughter loves only drives her deeper into his arms. But I started, quietly, to pay attention. And a man who pays attention always, eventually, sees. I have watched 100 men try to sell me a bad car, and they all share a certain quality, a slight over-eagerness in the eyes, a story that is just a little too smooth, an answer for every question that comes a half-second too fast. An honest man pauses. He says, "I am not sure, let me think." A con man never pauses, because the whole performance depends on never letting you stop and feel the ground. Trent never paused. Every question I asked him about his work, his past, his plans was met with an instant, polished, frictionless answer. And behind each answer was that faint over-eagerness, that hunger dressed up as charm. I did not need a folder to tell me what my son-in-law was. I had known from the first handshake. What I needed was proof, and time, and the patience to let a hungry man make the mistakes that hungry men always make. They married 8 months later, and Trent spared no expense, which struck me as strange for a man whose finances I could not actually locate. The wedding was lavish. A vineyard, a band, a guest list full of people who laughed too loudly at his jokes and whom none of us ever saw again. I paid for a good deal of it, because June asked me to, and because I would give my daughter anything. And I watched Trent move through that party like a man taking inventory. He worked the room, he name-dropped, and more than once, across all those flowers and lights, I caught him watching me, with a different expression than the one he wore for everyone else. A cool, measuring look. The look of a man trying to figure out exactly how much the quiet old father-in-law was really worth. There is a particular loneliness in being the only person in a happy room who can see the storm coming. I stood at the edge of my daughter's wedding, watching her laugh, watching her believe she was safe and chosen and loved. And I could not say a word, because there was nothing to say that would not have sounded like a bitter old man trying to ruin the best day of her life. I had no proof yet, only 50 years of instinct, and instinct is not something you can lay on a table in front of a woman in a white dress. So I danced with her. I told her she looked like her mother. I shook her new husband's practiced hand and wished them well. And I went home alone to a dark house. And I began that very night to plan how I would catch the man I had just watched marry my only child. It did not take him long to start circling the warehouse. It began gently, the way these things always do, with an offhand comment at a family dinner. He had heard I collected old cars. He found that so fascinating. He had some contacts in the classic auto world, high-end buyers, serious money, and he would just love to see the collection sometime, maybe help me realize what it was truly worth. I gave him the answer I gave everyone, the same tired, harmless answer I had used for 30 years. I told him it was mostly junk out there, a few projects I tinkered with to keep busy, nothing that would interest serious people, and that the building was a mess and not fit for visitors. I watched him file that answer away, and I watched him not believe a word of it. Over the following months, his interest sharpened from curiosity into something with teeth. He stopped pretending it was a hobby he found charming and started treating it like a problem to be solved. He would corner me at every gathering with a new angle. He knew a man who could appraise the collection for insurance, purely to protect me, of course. He worried, out loud and often, that I was getting older and that all that value, if there was any, was just sitting there unmanaged, exposed, a burden on June down the line. He offered, with enormous fake tenderness, to take some of that burden off my shoulders. Every conversation was a key being tried in a lock, and every time I smiled my slow, harmless smile and turned it aside. And every time I saw the frustration flicker behind his eyes before the charm slid back into place. I want to explain something about that harmless smile, because it was the most important tool I had, and it is a tool most men my age throw away without knowing its value. The world looks at a slow, quiet, smiling old man and sees someone weak, someone past his prime, someone who can be handled. I learned decades ago to let them see exactly that, because a man who underestimates you tells you everything. He relaxes. He gets careless. He shows you his real face, because he does not believe you are sharp enough to read it. Every time Trent walked away from one of our conversations, convinced he was dealing with a doddering old fool, he handed me another piece of himself, another glimpse of the impatience and the greed under the charm. My weakness was a costume, and he never once suspected that the tired old man he was so sure he could outmaneuver had been measuring him the entire time. A lesser man might have been flattered, or worn down, or fooled. But I had spent 50 years being lied to by people who wanted something I had, and I knew the difference between a man who is curious about your cars and a man who is hunting your fortune. Trent was hunting. So I decided it was time to stop watching him and start learning about him properly, the way you research a car before you buy it. Because the story a man tells you is never the story the paperwork tells. I made some calls to people I trust, and I hired a quiet, thorough man named Webb Harlan, a retired fraud investigator who now did discreet work for people like me. And I asked him one simple question. Who is my son-in-law, really, underneath the watch and the words? What Webb brought back to me 2 weeks later, in a plain folder over coffee at a diner off the highway, turned my slow suspicion into something cold and certain. I remember that morning at the diner with a strange clarity, the cracked vinyl booth, the coffee that tasted of the pot it had sat in too long, the dusty light through the window. Webb Harlan is a heavy, unhurried man who spent 30 years untangling other people's lies for a living, and he does not waste words. He set the folder on the table between us and did not open it right away. He looked at me first, the way a doctor looks at you before he gives you news, and he said, "Emmett, in my line of work, you get used to this, but I never like doing it to a good family." And then he opened the folder, and page by page, in his flat, careful voice, he took the confident, expensive image of Trent Voss and dismantled it down to the rusted frame underneath. And I drank bad coffee and felt my worst fears turn, one by one, into documented fact. Trent Voss was not an entrepreneur. He was a professional appearance, a man who had spent a decade building the image of wealth on a foundation of nothing. There were no successful companies. There were a string of failed ones, a trail of unpaid investors, and 2 prior relationships with women of some means that had ended the moment the money did. He was, at that moment, drowning. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, sinking fast, dodging creditors who were beginning to circle. The lavish wedding, the watch, the confident talk, all of it was being run on borrowed time and borrowed money. My daughter had not married a rich man. She had married a sinking one. And he had married her for a life raft he believed was hidden in my warehouse. But Webb had saved the worst for last, and when he laid it in front of me, my hands were not quite steady. Trent had already started taking from June. Quietly, cleverly, the way a man siphons gas so slowly the owner does not notice the gauge. He had gotten himself onto the accounts of her clinic under the guise of helping with the books, and money had begun to disappear. A few thousand here, a few thousand there, disguised as vendor payments and equipment costs. My daughter, who treated stray animals for free and lost sleep over other people's pets, was being robbed by the man who slept beside her, and she had no idea. Her clinic was quietly bleeding toward ruin, and she thought she was just having a hard year. That was the moment my grief for the situation hardened into resolve. He had crossed from lying to stealing, and from my fortune to my daughter, and there is no line more dangerous to cross with a man like me than the one that runs around my child. Up until I read about the clinic, some small, foolish, fatherly part of me had still been hoping I was wrong, or that the situation could be managed quietly. A bad marriage ended before it did real harm, everyone walking away with their dignity. That hope died at the diner table. A man who lies to impress is one thing. A man who reaches into the accounts of the woman who loves him and slowly bleeds her livelihood dry while she loses sleep worrying she is failing at the work she gave her life to is something else entirely. That is not weakness. That is predation. And the moment I understood that Trent had been feeding on my daughter's kindness, taking the very money she used to heal helpless animals, whatever mercy I might have felt for a drowning man went cold and quiet inside me, and in its place came the patient, deliberate resolve of a father who has decided exactly how a thing is going to end. There was one more thing in Webb's folder, the piece that told me exactly how this was going to end. Trent had not just been dreaming about the collection, he had been preparing to take it. Webb had found, through a contact, that Trent had commissioned a forged document, a consignment and sale agreement authorizing him to broker and liquidate my automobile collection on my behalf, complete with a signature meant to look like mine. It was clumsy work, the kind a desperate man buys cheap, but it was enough that if he could get the cars out of that building and to the right unscrupulous buyer, he could vanish with millions before anyone untangled the paperwork. He was not planning to ask me for the collection anymore. He was planning to steal it, sell it, and be gone, leaving my daughter holding an empty marriage and a bankrupt clinic. He just needed the one thing he did not have. He needed inside Bay 9. I understood, reading that I was no longer dealing with a slow-moving problem I could manage at my leisure. A man carrying a forged sale agreement is a man on a clock, because a forgery is only useful for a short window before someone checks it against the truth. Trent would move soon, and he would move hard, and when he did, my daughter would be standing directly in the blast. The only question left to me was whether I would let him detonate on his own terms, in the dark, in a way that might endanger June, or leave him room to wriggle free, or whether I would choose the ground myself, set the stage myself, and make certain that when the explosion came, it came in a place and a manner entirely of my choosing. I had spent 50 years being patient. Now, for the sake of my child, I needed to be something else. I needed to be precise. Now, most fathers at this point would have done one of two things. They would have gone straight to June with the folder, or they would have gone straight to Trent with their fists. I understand both urges. I felt both, standing in that diner parking lot with my heart pounding like a young man's. But 50 years of dealing with liars had taught me something that saved my whole family in the end. If you confront a con man with what you know, all you do is teach him what to hide. He simply adjusts and disappears and does it again to someone else, someone without a father watching. And if I went to June with an accusation and no undeniable proof, I risked driving her straight into his arms. Because that is what these men are good at, turning a father's warning into a father's jealousy. No, I was not going to warn Trent, and I was not going to accuse him. I was going to let him do exactly what he was planning to do, and I was going to make sure that when he did it into a trap that closed on him completely and left my daughter with the truth in her own two hands. So I began to build it. The way I build everything, slowly and with great care. The first and most important piece was the collection itself. I was not about to bait a trap with $50 million of irreplaceable history. Over 3 careful weeks, working nights with 2 men I have trusted for decades, I quietly emptied Bay 9. Every real car, every priceless machine Nadine and I had spent our lives saving was moved to a secure, anonymous storage facility 2 hours away, climate-controlled and guarded, under a name that led nowhere. I documented every move. When we were done, the building that Trent believed held his entire future contained nothing of any real value at all. But an empty building would have warned him, so I filled it back up. I filled Bay 9 with ghosts. Over the following days, I brought in a dozen genuine wrecks, the real junk of my trade, rusted shells and gutted project cars, and parts vehicles worth a few $100s apiece, and I arranged them under fine covers in the exact positions the real collection had occupied. In the dim light of that warehouse, a covered shape is a covered shape. To a greedy man in a hurry, they would look like a fortune. It was strange, almost dizzying work, filling my life's masterpiece with garbage. For 3 nights, I stood in that building and directed the placement of wrecks I would normally have sent to the crusher, arranging worthless shells in the exact footprints where machines worth millions had rested for years. And there was a grief in it I had not expected. Those covers had hidden real beauty for so long that draping them over ruin felt like a small blasphemy. But that was the whole point, and Nadine, I think, would have laughed her sharp laugh and approved. The trap depended on a simple truth of human nature I have watched play out my entire career. A greedy man does not check. He does not lift every cover and inspect every seam. He sees the shapes he expects to see, the shapes his forged inventory has promised him, and his own hunger fills in the rest. Trent would walk into that building already certain he was rich, and his certainty would do half my work for me. And then I planted the bait. I left out, in my study at home where I knew Trent snooped whenever he visited, a partial inventory, a beautiful, mouth-watering list of the real cars and their staggering values, cross-referenced to their supposed locations inside Bay 9. I made sure he would find it. I made sure the greed would do the rest. The next piece was the eyes. I had an old friend from my racing days whose son now installed security systems, and quietly, over a weekend, we wired Bay 9 and my home study with hidden cameras, small and silent, disguised as the ordinary junk of a working shop. A battered clock, a dusty radio, a smoke detector. Every angle was covered, every door. Nothing that happened inside that building or that study would go unseen or unrecorded. And then I made the most important call of all. I did not go to Trent, and I did not go to June. I went to the county sheriff's office, to a detective Webb knew and vouched for, a patient, careful woman named Detective Alvarez, and I laid the entire folder in front of her. The forged agreement, the financial fraud against my daughter, the plan I could see coming. I told her I did not want to scare him off with an arrest for the forgery alone. I wanted him caught in the act, beyond any lawyer's ability to explain away. Detective Alvarez listened to all of it, and then she gave me terms, and they were not easy ones. She agreed that a man who had commissioned a forgery and defrauded his wife was very likely to escalate, and that catching him mid-crime would be far stronger than any paperwork case. But she made me promise that I would not play hero, that when the night came, I would keep myself and, above all, my daughter clear of the building, and that I would let her people handle the dangerous end of it. I agreed to every word. There was only one part of the plan I insisted on, and I insisted on it with everything I had. When it finally happened, June would be with me, watching a live feed so that she would see the truth of her husband with her own eyes in real time and never have to wonder for the rest of her life whether her father had somehow framed a good man. She needed to see him choose it. That, I told the detective, was not negotiable. Detective Alvarez studied me for a long moment when I said that, the way you study a man to see whether he is asking out of vengeance or something cleaner. I told her I had no interest in humiliating Trent Voss, that his humiliation meant nothing to me. What I cared about was my daughter's mind, her ability to trust her own judgment again after a man had spent 2 years teaching her not to. If she only heard about it, I said, she would spend years wondering. If she saw it, she could begin to heal the very next morning. Alvarez was quiet, and then she nodded, slowly, and said that in 20 years of this work she had rarely heard a father think that far past his own anger. She agreed to my one condition. And then she went to work building her side of the operation, and I went home to build mine. And the two of us, the old car man and the patient detective, quietly closed a circle around a man who still believed he was the smartest person in every room he entered. Getting June to my house that night, and getting her to stay, was the hardest and most shameful piece of the whole thing, because I had to lie to my own daughter to do it. I told her Trent was away on business, which Webb had confirmed was the cover story Trent himself had given her. I told her I was feeling my age, that I wanted her company, that I had something important to talk to her about regarding her mother's things. All of it was true enough to hold, and all of it was a lie in service of something larger. And I hated every word. She came, of course. She always comes when her old man calls. She made us tea and sat with me in the living room, and we talked about Nadine, and she laughed at old stories, and the whole time my heart was breaking, because I knew that before this night was over, I was going to have to show my daughter the worst thing she would ever see, and there was no way to soften it. Trent took the bait exactly as I knew he would. Webb's contact confirmed that during his last visit to my house, while June and I were in the kitchen, Trent had been in my study for 11 minutes, and that the planted inventory had been photographed. After that, the man moved fast, because desperate men always do. He arranged his buyer. He hired his muscle, 2 men from out of the area whose records, Detective Alvarez later told me, were long and ugly. And he chose his night, a night he believed I would be nowhere near the property. He was half right. I was not near the warehouse. I was in my living room, 400 yards away, sitting in the dark beside my daughter, with a laptop open on the coffee table in front of us, and a detective and her people waiting in the almond grove across the road. The call came at 11:40 on a warm, dry night from Rafe Ortega, the caretaker who has looked after my property for 20 years and who was, that night, safely off-site and watching the same feed I was, exactly as the detective had arranged. His voice, even knowing the plan, was tight. He said the truck had come up the back access road with its lights off. He said there were 3 of them. He said they had bolt cutters, and that 2 of the men were carrying, and that they had just cut the chain off the main door of Bay 9. I sat there in the dark, and I put my hand over my daughter's hand, and I said the only thing I could say. I told her I needed her to look at the screen and to be brave, and that I was so sorry. And I turned the laptop toward her. June saw her husband before she understood what she was seeing. There he was, lit in the ghostly gray of a night vision camera, standing in the doorway of my warehouse in dark clothes, directing 2 large men with guns on their hips as they moved among the covered shapes. For a moment, she did not react at all. Her mind simply refused it, the way a mind does when the world turns upside down. She said his name, quietly, like a question. And then Trent pulled the cover off the first car, the way a man unwraps a gift, and the harsh reality of a rusted, gutted shell appeared in the green light. And we watched the confusion cross his face. And June made a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. It was not a scream. It was smaller and worse than a scream. It was the sound of a heart understanding all at once everything it had refused to see. Inside Bay 9, Trent's night was falling apart. He yanked the cover off a second car and a third, and each one was another worthless wreck, and I could see on the feed the exact moment his greed curdled into panic. He had come to steal a fortune and found a graveyard, and a man like Trent, whose entire life is a bluff, cannot survive the moment the bluff is called. He started shouting at his men, pointing, pulling covers, searching for the treasure that the beautiful forged inventory had promised him, and that was, by then, safely 2 hours away under another name. He had the forged sale agreement in his jacket. He had 2 armed felons in my building, and he had absolutely nothing to show for any of it except every single crime he had spent months preparing, all committed at once, on camera, in high definition. That was the moment Detective Alvarez had been waiting for. The almond grove across the road came alive with light. I heard, through the laptop and faintly through the warm night air, the amplified voice ordering the men inside the building to come out with their hands visible. On the screen, I watched Trent freeze, watched the calculation run behind his eyes, the same calculation I had seen him make at his own wedding. Except this time, there was no charming way out, no fast river of words that could carry him clear. His two hired men were violent, but they were not fools. I have thought about those two men since, the ones Trent hired to carry guns into my warehouse. They were hard, dangerous people with long records. And yet, in a strange way, they were more honest than the man who employed them. They knew exactly what they were, and they knew exactly what a night could cost them. And when the lights came on, and the choice was between a shootout over a building full of junk and putting their hands in the air, they made the sensible choice without a flicker of hesitation. It was Trent, the respectable one, the one in the nice clothes with the big watch, who could not accept reality even then, who kept talking, kept bargaining, kept insisting there had been a misunderstanding. The criminals surrendered. The con man argued. There is a whole sermon in that, if you care to hear it, about which men in this world are truly dangerous and which only look the part. They knew what happens to armed men who point weapons at sheriff's deputies, and they wanted no part of a shootout over a warehouse full of junk. They set their guns down and walked out with their hands up. And Trent Voss, the entrepreneur, the man who had married my daughter for a fortune, stood alone among the covered wrecks for one last second. And then he followed them out into the light. They put him on the ground in my own gravel, in the wash of a dozen headlights, and they read him his rights while he tried, even then, to talk his way out of it. I could hear the shape of it through the feed, the fast, desperate words, the claims that there had been a misunderstanding, that he had permission, that his father-in-law knew all about it. But permission does not come with bolt cutters, and it does not come with two armed felons and a forged signature in your jacket. And Detective Alvarez had heard every kind of misunderstanding there is. Beside me, June had gone very quiet. She had stopped making any sound at all. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched her marriage end in the green light of a night vision camera. And when I put my arm around her, she did not pull away. But she did not lean in either. She just watched and understood and grieved. And I let her. Because some things a person has to see all the way to the end. I have thought since about whether I was right to make her watch. It is the one part of the whole plan that still keeps me up some nights. A gentler man might have handled it all quietly and simply told her afterward. But I had learned something long ago that cost me to learn. When you are told a terrible truth about someone you love, some stubborn corner of your soul goes on doubting it forever, goes on wondering if it was really that bad, if there was some misunderstanding, if the people who told you were wrong or jealous. But when you see it with your own eyes, there is nowhere left for the doubt to live. I did not make my daughter watch to hurt her. I made her watch so that she would never, for the rest of her long life, lie awake wondering whether her father had lied to her about the man. She would know. She would have seen. And in the seeing, however brutal, was the beginning of her freedom. The morning after was one of the quietest of my life. June had slept eventually in her childhood room, and she came out to my kitchen pale and hollow-eyed, and she sat at the island where she had eaten breakfast as a girl, and I made her coffee and put Webb's folder on the counter between us. And I told her everything. All of it. The debt he had married her to escape. The two women before her. The clinic accounts he had been quietly draining, which explained the hard year she thought was just bad luck. The forged document. The plan. I had thought, in the days before, that telling her would feel like a victory, like being proven right. It did not. It felt like performing a surgery on someone I loved, cutting out something poisonous that had grown deep, necessary, and terrible all at once. I gave her the folder, and then I did the hardest thing, which was to be quiet and let her read it at her own pace, without rushing her, without softening it, without the temptation to say, "I told you so," a phrase I never once let cross my lips and never will. She read slowly. Sometimes she stopped and stared at nothing for a while, and I let her. Sometimes she went back and read a page again, as though the second time it might say something kinder. And it never did. I made fresh coffee twice. The morning light moved across my kitchen floor, and by the end of it, when she finally closed the folder, my daughter was not the same woman who had opened it, and she never would be again. Something innocent had been taken from her, but something stronger was already growing in its place, and I could see it in the set of her jaw, and it broke my heart and made me proud in the very same breath. She read every page. She did not cry until the very end, and when she did, it was not for Trent. It was for herself, for the year of her life he had stolen, and for the trust in people he had broken in her. Trent tried from the county jail to reach her. He wrote letters full of the old smooth words, love and misunderstanding and second chances, and when she did not answer, he changed his tune to blame, to how her father had entrapped him, manipulated him, set the whole thing up. And here is where I saw the woman my daughter truly is, the woman Nadine and I raised. June read one of those letters, and then she set it down, and she said, quietly, that she finally understood the difference between the sound a man makes when he is sorry and the sound he makes when he is caught. She did not answer his letters. She did not visit. She filed for divorce, and she pressed every charge the district attorney offered on the theft from her clinic. And she did it with her back straight and her eyes clear. And I have never, in all the years of my life, been prouder to be her father. The law did the rest. With the recordings, the forged agreement, the financial trail Webb had documented, and the two armed men who quickly decided to testify against the man who hired them, there was no case to make and nothing to argue. Trent Voss pleaded out rather than face the full weight of a trial, and he was sentenced on charges of burglary, conspiracy, forgery, and the fraud against my daughter. And he will spend a long stretch of years in a state prison thinking about the fortune that was never where he thought it was. The lavish life, the watch, the fast talk, all of it was gone, revealed at last as the empty paint job it had always been. He had spent 2 years and every ounce of his cleverness hunting a treasure in my warehouse, and in the end, the only thing he ever managed to take possession of was a cell. A few weeks after the dust settled, when June was steadier, I did the thing I had been waiting 30 years to do. I drove her out to the anonymous storage facility 2 hours away, and I walked her down a long, quiet row. And one by one, I pulled the covers off the cars. The real ones. I watched my daughter's face as she understood, slowly, what she was looking at, as the numbers I finally spoke out loud began to register, as the shape of the fortune her mother and I had hidden from her for her whole life came into focus. She did not react the way a greedy person reacts. She stood very still, and she reached out and touched the fender of the pre-war roadster the way you touch something holy. And she said, in a small voice, "Why did you never tell me?" And I told her the truth. "Because I wanted you to be loved for you," I said, "and never once to wonder." And she understood, and she wept. And this time, it was not grief. It was something closer to being, finally, fully seen. We stayed in that storage facility far longer than I had planned. I walked her down the whole row and told her the story of each car, where I found it, what it had been, what Nadine had seen in it that no one else could. This one from a barn in Nevada, This one from the estate of a man who died without an heir. This one we argued about for a week before we bought it because I thought it was junk and she knew it was treasure. And she was right. She was always right. And as I talked, I watched something come back into my daughter's face that Trent had taken out of it. A kind of light, a sense of belonging to something older and truer than the cheap, glittering lie she had almost lost herself inside. These cars were not just a fortune. They were the record of her parents' love. 40 years of two people chasing beauty together. And now, at last, she was part of the story. I have since done what I should have arranged years ago, though I thank God the timing worked as it did. The collection is now held in a trust, structured carefully by a good attorney, protected against exactly the kind of man who nearly took it. And June is its sole heir, with safeguards that no future Trent will ever pick. But June, being June, did not want a museum of expensive cars to sit locked away. So together we started something with it, a foundation in Nadine's name that takes in young people from hard circumstances, kids with no direction and clever hands, and teaches them the trade I love, the slow and honest work of bringing dead machines back to life. The first of them start next month in a real shop, learning to tell filler from steel and truth from a good paint job. Her mother's name is on the door. I will teach some of those first classes myself, as long as these hands hold out. I want to stand in a real shop again, with the smell of oil and metal and possibility, and show a kid the world has already written off how to run a thumb along a hidden seam and feel the exact place where a lie begins. It is the most useful thing I know, and it turns out it is not really about cars at all. It is about the whole of life. The world is full of beautiful surfaces stretched over emptiness, full of Trent Vosses with their big watches and their fast words. And a young person who can tell the real from the counterfeit is a young person who will be much harder to fool and much harder to rob. That is what Nadine and I are leaving behind in the end. Not a pile of expensive cars, a handful of young people who know how to tell the truth from the paint. And the clinic, of course, is safe. The money Trent bled from it was recovered, and June treats her strays and her hawks and her old farm dogs without a single worry. Exactly as she was always meant to. I think a great deal these quiet evenings about the difference between what is real and what is only made to look real. Because that difference is the whole of my trade, and it turns out, the whole of this story. For 50 years, I made my living being able to tell them apart, running my hand along a seam to feel where the truth stopped. Trent Voss never learned that skill, and it destroyed him. He believed the paint job was the car. He believed the watch was the wealth. He believed my daughter was a key to a locked room instead of the treasure herself. He spent his whole life polishing a surface over an emptiness. And when the covers finally came off, in that warehouse, in that green light, there was nothing underneath but rust. And everyone could see it at last, including the woman he had fooled. June comes out to the property most Sundays now, sometimes with a rescued dog in the passenger seat, and we sit on the porch as the valley heat finally breaks in the evening, and we talk. And sometimes we walk down to the shop and I show her how a thing is done. She is learning the trade a little, not for the money, but for the love of it, the way her mother did. The wound Trent left is healing into a scar, and a scar, as any old man will tell you, is just proof that you survived something. She is safe. That was the only promise I ever made to her dying mother, the only word that ever truly mattered. Not rich. safe. And she is. Sometimes, on the Sundays she comes out, I catch her standing at the edge of the property looking at Bay 9, that ugly, rusted building where her whole life turned on a single night. And I wonder what she sees when she looks at it. I asked her once. She was quiet for a while, and then she said that she used to see the worst night of her life out there, but that lately she had started to see something else. She said she had started to see the place where her father had been protecting her all along, for 30 years, in ways she never knew, and that the ugliness of the building was the whole point, the same way the ugliness of the year she spent with Trent had, in the end, taught her more about strength than any easy happiness ever could. My daughter is wiser now than her cheerful youth ever let her be. It cost her dearly. But she is standing on her own 2 feet, clear-eyed and unafraid. And there is no fortune in any warehouse in the world worth more to me than that.
This is a work of fiction, and the voice you have been listening to is not a living man.
But the lesson underneath it is as real as steel under paint. For 50 years, I learned to tell the genuine article from the counterfeit, to trust the seam and not the shine. And everything that saved my family in the end came from that one hard-won skill. A liar can fool the eye. He cannot fool the hand that knows what it is feeling for. My son-in-law thought an old man in a dusty shop was an easy mark, a fortune guarded by nothing but rust and forgetfulness. He never understood that the rust was the guard, and that the man in the dusty shop had spent his whole life waiting to tell the fake from the true. They wanted my inheritance. In the end, the only thing they inherited was the ruin they built with their own hands. My name is Emmett Cade, and everything Nadine and I saved from the rust and the ruin, I kept safe for the one person who was ever worth it.